All right. Well, thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be speaking with Professor Chris Kaczor. He's out from Loyola Marymount University in LA. And Professor Kaczor has a new book on Thomas Aquinas and the Cardinal Virtues. So we're going to be speaking to him a little bit about that. It can be kind of a technical discussion for people who aren't into virtue ethics or some terminology and all of that. But Professor Kaczor's book is pretty intentional about trying to get beyond that and make it more approachable. But I've just worked my way through the book, and it's somebody who doesn't have a doctorate in this kind of thing. It was very approachable and was able to teach me a lot more than I was on the topic. So I thank you, Professor Kaczor, for being with us.
Thank you, and thanks for the kind words about my book. I appreciate it. The book was really geared to people like you. It's not meant just for experts. It's meant for people that are interested in the virtues or interested in Aquinas and maybe haven't, approached it before. And so basically what I try to do is have the text of Aquinas and then basically explain in the footnotes things that people that are approaching the text for the very first time would need to know in order to really understand and gain something from what Aquinas says.
Absolutely. And just to give people a little more background on you, how did you get to the point where you're somebody who's writing scholarly works and on Thomas Aquinas and natural law, virtue ethics, things like that?
Well, I guess in a way I got into it by accident. When I went to graduate school, I was thinking of working on St. Augustine and Dante, but I had a great teacher named Ralph McInerney. And actually today's the day on which he died, January 29th, about 11 years ago. Anyway, I had him, I was a teaching assistant for him in his course called Thought of Aquinas. And I never really studied Aquinas before. And so he was such a good teacher, and I learned so much in the course and have dedicated myself to learning more about Aquinas and studied more with him, studied with other people. And so as a result, I think I see as part of what I want to do to try to introduce other people to Aquinas. And so the book is basically, as I mentioned, kind of Aquinas is above, from the Summa, his actual writing, and below I kind of try to explain it and make it accessible to people who maybe are approaching it for the first time.
Absolutely. I noticed that and I think the first part of your introduction to the whole book, you talked about a story about going up to your attic as a kid and trying to read Aquinas and be like, I know all these words, but I don't really understand. They're not sinking in. I'm familiar with that. You're reading some work and you understand all the words. They don't really sink in. So I like the way you laid it out too with, if you're not familiar with Aquinas, he has a lot of questions and then he has objections to his thought. But a lot of times they'll list all the objections, or that's how he does it. And then he'll answer all those objections. In Professor Kaczor's book, he was another way that it was more approachable was after each objection, then he would answer it, then another objection, so it kind of, in a way that Aquinas wasn't being quite as user-friendly. But so what made you overall, just when you were on this particular topic, do you think there was maybe a dearth of information on the Cardinal Virtues, at least in a way that would be more approachable to a general audience?
Yeah, so I was inspired to do this book, and two books actually, one on the Cardinal Virtues and one on the Theological Virtues, by another teacher I had of mine named Peter Kraft. So Peter Kraft has a book called A Summa of the Summa, and the book focuses basically on God, on anthropology, on things like natural law, but he stops the book before he gets to the part of the Summa that talks about the theological virtues and the cardinal virtues. So basically, I thought that, this part of the Summa actually was historically the most popular part. So if you look at the manuscript transmissions of the Summa, before the printing press, the most popular parts of it were the parts that I'm summarizing here, the parts about the theological virtues and the cardinal virtues. And so, because Peter Kraft's book doesn't cover that at all, I thought, well, there's really room for another book, and actually two books, that cover this material. And I'm really glad I did it because I've taught these books a number of times for classes that are introduction to Aquinas. And I think the students really can understand it and get something out of it. And so, I'm really, really glad I had a chance to do it.
From a 10,000-foot view, what's the difference for any viewers on theological virtues and cardinal virtues? Because they're all the seven Christian virtues, but what's the distinction?
Yeah, so the theological virtues are all directly about. So faith is belief in God, hope is trust that God will give us eternal happiness, and finally, love of God. The cardinal virtues are virtues that don't directly do with God, but rather indirectly. So, for instance, practical wisdom, knowing the right thing to do in the situation, justice, giving to human beings and God what's due to them, courage, right, doing the right thing despite difficulties and dangers, and then finally temperance, which is enjoying bodily pleasures in such a way that doesn't interfere with love of God or love of neighbor. So that's the basic difference between the theological virtues having to do with God and then the cardinal virtues not have to do with God.
Yeah, I like the way, I think that was at the beginning of the introduction. You're like, there were, there's Stephen Covey, who had the 7 habits of successful people. You're like, these are kind of the 7 habits for happiness. The theological virtues about happiness in heaven, and the cardinal virtues about habits that we can create for human happiness on earth. If Aquinas were looking at modern American life, there's a lot of talk about, virtue signaling or virtue. People talk about the virtues, but maybe American virtues, we look a lot at tolerance and equality and openness, things like that. What do you think his thoughts would be on our thought of virtue?
Well, Aquinas' account of virtue is very much linked to his understanding of who we are as human beings. And so he thinks that the virtues, the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues, you might say, are always relevant for human beings, whether they're living now in the Middle Ages or, centuries ago. And so I think he might be a little bit suspicious of new virtues in the sense of, given that human beings don't really change, and given that the ultimate goal of human beings to love God and love neighbor, to find perfect happiness in heaven and at least some share of happiness here on earth, given that those goals remain the same, I think it'd be a little wary of just sort of making up new virtues that don't really directly connect to our human nature or our human destiny.
I guess one example of that, he talked about for temperance, he talked Aquinas that shamefacedness was an integral part of that, the temperance being self-control. And you see a lot of people talk about, we shouldn't be, excuse my language, but slut shaming or body shaming, these things that have to do with our appetites for sex, food, drink, and that it's sort of a negative thing to shame people in those areas, where it seems like he's saying that's actually a part of having these virtues, is understanding that we should try to avoid being shamed morally in front of other people for failing to live up to that. So do you have any thoughts on that? Just kind of how we could be almost living the opposite from that, in his view of having the capacity for shame.
Yeah, so I think Aquinas' view is something like we ought to enjoy things that are good, and we ought to not enjoy and be ashamed of and have displeasure in things that are bad. Now, that can get messed up, though, right? You could have somebody who enjoys doing something really bad. And so for Aquinas, that would be indicative of someone who has a disordered appetite and disordered soul. On the other hand, what he hopes is going to happen for us is that as we continually choose things that are good, we grow to become more and more familiar with those things, and then become more and more such a person that enjoys those sorts of things. So, all of us are always in a state of flux. And what I mean is, obviously, we're all growing older, but we also change each time we choose, and especially choose something significant. So Aquinas' view is something like that we ought not to be so concerned about what gives us pleasure or displeasure in the moment, but what we ought to focus on is what really is the best thing to do. And if we continually try to choose that, what's going to happen is our character is going to change, and then eventually we're going to actually enjoy choosing whatever is the best thing to do. And the reverse, we will not enjoy. We will find it painful to even think about doing something bad, right? So, you're a dad, I am too. So hopefully we think, look, I don't want to harm my children. That thought gives me pain. Of course, doing something terrible to my kids, I don't want to do that at all. And if you're a good parent, right, you want and enjoy doing good things for your kids. And you're pained at doing the opposite of that, harming them in some way. So Aquinas's insight, I think, is really important because we're not fixed. We're not like statues that are just exactly the way we are. Our choices help shape who we are, and who we are helps determine what we really enjoy and what gives us pain.
Could part of the conflict there be our understanding of happiness? If you're saying that cardinal virtues are meant to lead us towards human happiness, but I think a lot of people hear the word virtue and maybe think it's stifling their free choice. And when you think of, and the Declaration of Independence talks about pursuit of happiness, that maybe the way a modern American looks at it would be different than kind of the eudaimonia, maybe, is that how they say it, of Aristotle, or that flourishing, that maybe we're not looking at happiness in that way that he would have wanted people to aim for.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So Aristotle's understanding of happiness and Aquinas is actually quite different than what some people think of happiness. So if you think of happiness just as, eating an ice cream cone or something, I think Aquinas would say, well, that is a kind of happiness. It's a kind of pleasure, but that's not really the deepest or most significant kind of happiness. So what is? Well, his view is that the deepest kind of happiness is a kind of activity that we get in loving God and loving other people. So you might say that happiness is constituted by having loving relationships with other people. So the virtues come in because it's pretty hard, if not impossible, to have loving relationships with other people if you're lacking courage, right? Because every time there's danger, every time something threatens me, well, I'm going to stop loving others, and I'm going to, try to protect myself or whatever. So I'm going to give up on love. And the same thing's true with temperance, right? If I'm an alcoholic and I get totally drunk all the time, well, how am I going to be a good husband, a good father, a good friend? I'm not going to be able to be any of those things. So the virtues are really important as kind of habits of the heart that enable us to continue loving people given the difficulties of human life, right? Both the pleasures that could tempt us away from love and also the dangers that could tempt us away from love. We need virtues to, we need virtues to protect us against those sort of temptations and those sorts of weaknesses that can happen to anyone.
Out of those four, prudence or wisdom, why do they call that the mother of all virtues? You hear that sometimes, when they look at the four cardinal. You just talked about, fortitude and temperance, maybe dealing with the passions, but you often hear that. Maybe that's not Aquinas as much, more is that Aristotle, but you hear that as sort of the mother of the virtues would be wisdom. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, so practical wisdom is necessary for the exercise of any virtue. So think about the virtue of temperance. So temperance is eating, for instance, involves eating food in the right way. So what is that? Well, you can't lay down a strict rule that applies to everyone. In other words, always eat one cheeseburger. Well, no, like sometimes if you're really overweight, you probably shouldn't have any cheeseburgers. And if you're starving to death and you're not gonna be able to eat for a month, maybe you should try to eat 3 cheeseburgers, right? There's no kind of single rule, always eat one or always eat a half or whatever. So what practical wisdom is about is you have a good end, right? You want to love God and you want to love neighbor. And so you think about, in my concrete circumstances, what's the right thing for me to do here and now to serve that good end? And basically there's almost innumerable possibilities, right? I mean, should I take out the garbage right now? Should I call my mom right now? Should I try to help my son with his homework right now? I'm not sure. But the person of practical wisdom is someone who takes into account all the concrete circumstances and then comes to a good judgment about here and now, given who I am, given who I'm going to be able to help, this is the right thing for me to do here and now. So if you're lacking practical wisdom, basically what happens is you can't really have any of the other virtues, right? You're not going to have temperance because you're not going to know the right amount to eat. You're not going to have courage because you're not going to know whether you should stay and fight in the battle or whether in this case you should run away. You're not going to be able to do all the things you need to do in order to live a good life. So you might say practical wisdom is the mother of the virtues because like all of us, we need a mother, right? I mean, I wouldn't be here if I didn't have a mother. So if we don't have practical wisdom, we're not going to get to a good life.
We touched a little bit on temperance and maybe a little on fortitude, but the one we haven't really mentioned much, justice. Would you say a little bit about that? Because I guess the way he laid it out, split up commutative justice and distributive justice, but just in terms of just kind of a broad idea of why that justice is split into two things and what justice as a virtue is.
Yeah, so justice is, in general, giving to each what is due to each. And so we can distinguish different kinds of justice based on that. So I owe my dad something different than I owe you. Why? Well, because my dad raised me, and so I owe him, something special. I owe God more than I owe my dad. Why? Well, because God gave me everything ultimately, so I owe God the most. And so justice has, you might say, different aspects or part based on what you owe to each. So this distinction between commutative justice and distributive justice has to do with the distinction between justice between individuals. So like what I owe to you or what I owe to just Joe Blow on the street versus, for instance, distributing things to people. If I were, in charge of the government, how ought I distribute things to people? Well, that's a different relationship than just one private person to another private person. Distributive justice is the justice involved in, say, organizations of a group, where you have the leader of the group relating to the other members of the group. But all these kinds of justice are meant to illuminate different ways in which the fundamental principle applies. And the fundamental principle is that we ought to give to each what is due to each.
Do you have a thought on the term social justice? Because I did notice that it said all justice is other-centered. So it seems like, in a way, all justice would be social justice in that sense, that it's, dealing with social aspect of life. Is that a term that's redundant then, or would that be more about distributive justice, since it's often about how government should be run? Or
yeah, so the term social justice is not found, as far as I know, in Aquinas. What the term means now depends on who's talking about it. But one way to think about it is that social justice has to do with pursuit of the common good. And the idea there is something like we ought to set things up so that each person is able to flourish. And so if society is set up so that each person is able to flourish, that is a just society in the sense of social justice. If, on the other hand, parts of society, all Black people or whatever, are excluded from the conditions that are necessary in order to flourish, we might call that an unjust society. But for Aquinas, at least, justice is always involving at least two parties. In other words, he thinks I can't be unjust to myself. So if for instance, I can't really steal from myself, right? If I remove money from my savings account and put it in my checking account, well, that's not theft, right? I can't steal from myself. On the other hand, if I remove money from your bank account without your permission to put it in mine, well, then I can. That is theft. So justice always involves, on his view, two parties. And the two parties could be one human being and another human being, or the two parties could be, say, an individual human being and God, but there has to be some other regardingness in justice. It's not just unlike temperance. So temperance is a virtue that isn't immediately and directly about others, but it's more about myself. So for instance, I could be intemperate, say drink way too much alcohol and just be totally alone. And it doesn't, I'm not driving drunk. I'm not, getting drunk and hitting someone. I'm just all by myself and I get, really drunk. Well, Aquinas would say that's an act of intemperance, even though it doesn't affect anyone else. Whereas injustice, he would say, I can't commit an act of injustice against myself.
On temperance, as you're saying, it seems like he said it was food, drink, and sex were the three
Right.
things, they're bodily pleasures. I was trying to think, a lot of our pleasures seem to be entertainment based now. They're not necessarily about a human need, but would he include something like binging on Netflix or things that aren't necessarily a human need, like entertainment, digital, things like that? Because people talk about fasting from those things. They talk about them as if they're things that are sort of related to temperance. But yeah, I'm just wondering how he would see that, or how you would see that.
Yeah. So Aquinas thinks that temperance, properly speaking, strictly speaking, has to do with pleasures of touch, bodily pleasures, like eating, drinking, and sex. But in an extended sense, you can also talk about pleasures in a broader sense, like, watching Netflix, or like, I don't know, just yeah, doing something fun. So yeah, you can, even though strictly speaking, in the most precise sense, pleasure or temperance is only about bodily pleasures like food, drink, and sex. In a broader sense, you can't speak of temperance with respect to, yeah, social media, for example.
And would he think our society was pretty far out of whack in that sense on entertainment pleasure not being tempered by our virtue in that area? Or do you get the sense that's they didn't have those kind of options and we aren't really seeking virtue in the area in a way he would understand?
Yeah, so I definitely think you can obviously overdo, something that in itself is not problematic. And use of social media could fall into that category. I mean, if you're neglecting other things you ought to do, if you're wasting hours and hours and hours, then yeah, it seems like he would say that's intemperance in the broader sense of not enjoying something in a reasonable way. On the other hand, it seems to me that use of social media could be perfectly fine as long as it was tempered, moderated, not excessive, etc., as a way of diversion or reconnecting with people or whatever. That seems like all perfectly fine. But again, like anything that in itself is not problematic, overdoing it could be. I mean, it's not problematic in itself to drink water, but I mean, if you drink, 5 gallons an hour, well, yeah, that'll kill you. Almost anything that can taking too much can be bad for you.
About finding that balance, it seems like. I mean, that was Aristotle's golden mean. It seems like he's kind of he calls him the philosopher in the Summa. So it seems like that was one thing I was wondering is, do you think he puts, maybe for a modern audience who isn't very dependent on authorities, it seems like a lot of his answers are, I answer yes, or because the philosopher said this or Augustine said this. It seems like maybe he leans on authority in a way that modern people are like, no, you have to prove it a little more than just that.
Yeah, so Aquinas definitely does appeal to authorities. And part of the reason he does that is he wants to put his own view in conversation with other people that have been in the conversation, you might say. But you'll probably note in the Summa, he doesn't just say, Aristotle said that, that's the end of the discussion. The fact that Aristotle or Augustine or whoever says something is not the end of the discussion, but really the beginning, because he goes on in all those cases to explain, for instance, why Aristotle's view in this case is right or partially right, or he goes on to explain using argumentation why he thinks what he thinks. So another thing to keep in mind is for Aquinas, Aristotle is a little bit like how people today would use science, right? So in other words, he had a huge respect, just as many people today have a huge respect for what scientists tell us. He thinks of Aristotle as the preeminent one who knows. And so he's leaning on Aristotle's authority, again, the way we might lean on this authority of, I don't know, Dr. Fauci or something. Say, look, he's,
Yeah,
he knows all about this. So that's why we appeal to what he says.
absolutely. On Fortitude, I guess we haven't touched on that one quite as much yet, but I was just kind of curious on exposure therapy is a way they deal with a lot of anxiety problems. And, when I was reading through, his treatment of Aquinas' treatment of Fortitude, I was just thinking, I wonder if this discovery by psychologists that exposing people to their fears is a way for them to overcome anxiety disorders. We've more medicalized it, obviously, but it seems like picking up some of that wisdom from back in virtue ethics, that courage is a way, confronting your fears, doing the right thing despite your fears is a way to happiness. Because we look at it as expose yourself to your fear of public speaking enough and you won't have a phobia of it. But I was wondering what you thought about maybe that kind of ancient wisdom sort of being rediscovered in some of that way we look at anxiety. Fortitude can deal with anxiety in that way.
Yeah, that's a great connection, David. I think you're right. There's a lot of overlap I find between what Aquinas says and various things with what contemporary psychology finds about various things. And that's a great example how courage is the facing of one's fears and doing the right thing despite that fear. So, Aquinas thought to gain a virtue, at least the acquired virtues, you have to do acts repeatedly of that kind of virtue. So yeah, he didn't use the language of exposure therapy, but it's the same sort of idea. In other words, if you want to be brave, well, you better expose yourself to frightening situations and go to Marine boot camp and go through the basic training and you go through all these scary things. But at the end of all that training, you're a Marine and you're tough. And when the battle breaks out, you're not completely freaked out the way you would have been if you had never gone through basic training. So, this idea of, training ourselves to be able to confront our fears is certainly something contemporary psychology talks about, but it's also implicit in, our military, basic training exercises.
I know you said that it's Aquinas would say these virtues are always applicable because human nature doesn't change. But is there a way, I guess, you would encourage people to take these virtues, wisdom and courage, or fortitude, temperance and justice, and kind of look at them as being applicable to their life? Is that kind of what you're? Not that's a leading question, but is that kind of what you're thinking, making a more approachable look at the cardinal virtues?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the cardinal virtues are directly applicable to all of our lives, right? For instance, think of the virtue of temperance in terms of eating, right? Everybody eats, right? And you can eat too much, and you can eat in such a way that doesn't serve your health, and you can eat in such a way that it is offensive to others. So, we're all eating pretty much every day, I hope, unless you're starving to death. And, the virtue of temperance is a very much an everyday kind of virtue. So how would you make that real? Well, in terms of eating, one thing that you could do, and some saints have recommended, is at each meal to do something at that meal that you otherwise wouldn't do. So for instance, maybe you don't put butter on your bread, or you don't put sugar in your coffee, or you eat the vegetables first and the steak second, or whatever. But the basic idea is you do a little sacrifice, a little bit of mortification, a little act of temperance to sort of help you to become more temperate. So that idea of temperance applies also to courage, right? Every day, virtually, we have things that are difficult for us to do, things that are challenging, and we can wimp out and say, oh, it's too much, I'm going to do the easy thing. Or we could choose to do something that's a little tough and a little demanding, and I'm going to push through and show a little act of courage. Now, most of us are not going to be in the battlefield with bullets whizzing by our head, but all of us face difficulties in everyday life, even things as every day as the alarm goes off in the morning. You just sleep in and just sit there, or do you get out of bed, right? I mean, again, it's not battlefield courage, but it is a little bit doing something a little difficult, a little challenging. But again, these virtues are really everyday things. These virtues aren't like once in a lifetime when I'm in the middle of a gun battle, I'm going to do something courageous. Well, yeah, that would be courageous, but the virtues really are everyday things of doing whatever we're doing in ways that are just, in showing temperance in terms of food, drink, and sex, and courage in terms of difficulties, etc.
And I guess the cardinal virtues have to kind of be rooted in, I think that's the language in the catechism, is that you have to root the cardinal virtues in the theological virtues, or they can get off track. So I think, if you had, in the Odyssey, you had Odysseus come back after the suitors had been trying to get marry his wife, and he was brave in battle, but he ended up just killing all these suitors, something like that, where you're being brave, but it's not rooted in charity.
Yeah, so Aquinas gets an idea from Augustine, who got it from St. Paul. And the basic idea is that without love, all these other virtues, so to speak, are not really worth anything. So Aquinas thinks, and again, he's not original in this, he thinks that you need love, you need charity in order to make all the other virtues kind of living and good. So if I'm lacking charity, my courage goes off in the wrong direction, my so-called courage. So he would say it's not real courage at all if I'm lacking charity. It's not real temperance at all. To have a real virtue, it has to line us up to the real ultimate end, which is God. And to be lined up to the real ultimate end, which is God, requires charity.
So you did say you wrote a separate book. So if anybody's interested in the theological virtues, this one's on the cardinal virtues, and there's a separate one, kind of a companion, I guess.
That's right. I got it right here.
There it is. I think I'm going to have to pick that one up because I enjoyed this one, at least, also just to check back in on as a reference too. So,
yeah, thank you, David. Appreciate it.
Definitely. And I guess, as you're saying, you have to connect the cardinal virtues to the theological virtues, and the cardinal virtues being habits that with human effort we can work on. Is there something other than praying that a person can do with, because I know that they come from grace, theological virtues. Yeah. Is there some way to grow in those other than praying for the grace, for the theological virtues?
Yeah, so Aquinas thinks all the sacraments help us to grow in the theological virtues. And the other way to grow, you're right, that the theological virtues are gifts given by God, but they're gifts in a way that we can block, right? In other words, the sun is a gift, but we can block the sun by closing the shades. So to be open to the gifts God gives, not to put obstacles in God's way, is also a way to increase the theological virtues. In other words, it's not increasing in the sense of making the sun shine. God makes the sun shine, but by opening the curtains, as it were, to allow God's grace to come to us more fully.
If somebody gives you a gift at Christmas and you just never open it and leave it in the corner.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I don't know if there's anything else. Maybe how on the reception of the book, have you heard a lot from people who are picking it up and commenting back?
Yeah, so the book just came out, so far I haven't heard too much, but the things I have heard have been quite positive. So yeah, thank you, David. I appreciate you talking with me today, and yeah, maybe we can chat again at some point in the future.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again, and this has been Professor Kaczor. He's got a new book. I think it's the Cardinal Virtues and Thomas Aquinas. What's the exact title? Sorry.
The exact title is Thomas Aquinas on the Cardinal Virtues, a Summa of the Summa on justice, courage, temperance, and practical wisdom.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again, and go pick up that book if you're interested in the cardinal virtues and virtue ethics in general. So thank you, Professor Kaczor.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.